Welcome to Faculty Voices. Kathryn Sikkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Kathryn, welcome.
Thanks for the invitation.
Your research team has been doing a lot of investigations into transitional justice. First of all, for those in our audience who may not be familiar with the term, what is transitional justice?
Transitional justice involves a series of mechanisms that countries used to deal with the past, deal with human rights violations and mass atrocity in the past. And so those mechanisms can include, for example, human rights prosecutions, but also truth commissions, reparations policies, something that we call vetting or lustration policies, and many more issues. Those of us who work in Latin America know all about questions of memorialization, museums of memory, but also the role that the arts have played in terms of memory. So transitional justice can be all that. Our database doesn't try to deal with memorialization or the arts, but we do include data about trials, about reparations policies, amnesty laws, vetting policies, and truth commissions.
So, who is the intended audience for this database?
The intended audience includes academics, of course, academics who are interested both qualitatively and quantitatively in this issue. But it also includes policymakers. Our funding for this last round, the last 3 years of this project came from the Global Affairs Canada, which is the Canadian Foreign Ministry. And they are interested in victim-centered, evidence-based foreign policy. They're also interested in a feminist foreign policy.
Oh, that's interesting.
We can talk about that later, but they really wanted to make sure that our project had outreach to policymakers. And then finally, it's open to the general public and students. And so we tried to make the website where the data is presented as accessible as possible. So someone who was interested in a single country or a single mechanism could go to the database and kind of noodle around and learn a thing or two.
What have been your principal findings?
First, I need to say that I have been working on transitional justice issues for a long time. So my first article on this topic was published in 2001 with my dear colleague Ellen Lutz. I wrote a book called The Justice Cascade in 2011 about the topic. And so there have been many findings over many years. What I want to share with you, though, are the findings that have been reconfirmed by the new data and the latest research, but also findings that have changed.
Oh, that's interesting.
So the most important finding that I think that has been reconfirmed is first that victims in much of the world who have experienced human rights violations and mass atrocity have long demanded justice and continue to demand justice. So these mechanisms are not something that Global Affairs Canada or USAID impose upon countries. They very often, as you know well, June, because you've worked on this as well, they very often come from demands of victims for accountability for crimes. So that's one finding, and that finding comes through surveys that members of my team have continued to do in new countries like Ethiopia or Ukraine, where they find that as we saw in Chile and Argentina in the past, victims today in these new conflict societies still are asking for accountability. A second finding that has been confirmed by our data is that many of these transitional justice mechanisms can have a positive effect on human rights and on conflict and even on democracy. So quantitative analysis here shows that transitional justice is associated with some improvements that we see in issues we care about, human rights violations can decline in countries that have really made an effort with accountability. Conflict is not exacerbated, as some have claimed, but in fact, there's a greater likelihood that conflict will not reoccur in countries that have really grappled with the past. So that's a second finding that has been confirmed by the very latest data. Okay. The one where there's been a big change, and this involves me personally as an academic, professionally and personally as an academic, is that the number of human rights trials in the world has declined since 2010.
Is that because there are fewer gross human rights violations?
So the name of my book was The Justice Cascade, and it was built on this early data. And the book was published in 2011, and I had data up to 2010. And we now look back and see that 2010 was the year that prosecutions peaked in the world. And they have been declining between 2010 and 2020. So we're working on this right now. We don't have a fully satisfactory explanation. But what I can say is, and I said this in the Justice Cascade, the Justice Cascade depended on the third wave of democracy. That was kind of a necessary condition. And we know, those of us who work on Latin America know that, right? We know that demand for justice could be satisfied when these countries had transitions to democracy. Well, in the world, the third wave of democracy is over, and there is no fourth wave. Democracy, as colleagues at Dr. Class, like Steve Levitsky, have pointed out, democracy is in crisis in the world, and the number of democracies has not increased. And there's been there's a lot of disagreements about how much democracy has decreased. It's not in free fall. No one thinks democracy is in free fall in the world, but we know it leveled off and has started to gradually decrease. And so if the Justice Cascade depended on democracy, if democracies don't increase, you're not going to have as many trials. And that's what's happened.
Could you relate each of those principal findings to Latin America and perhaps pick out a couple of countries in Latin America to talk about specifically?
So the country I have long worked on is Argentina. Argentina, along with Chile, are the two countries in the entire database that have the most human rights prosecutions in the world, the most domestic human rights prosecutions in the world. So first, this finding, you and I know, since we've worked on Chile and Argentina, we know that victims in these countries, organized in human rights organizations, have demanded justice and kept demanding justice even when confronted with amnesty laws that shut down a lot of these trials. They were able eventually to see that the amnesty laws were either overturned or they did an end run around them, and were able to secure really massive numbers of human rights prosecutions for disappearances, for murder, for kidnapping, etc. And so if you want to look at, demand for justice, I think the cases throughout in the Southern Cone, like Chile and Argentina, are a good example. But there are other examples from Latin America that are troubling. So we have countries like Brazil and El Salvador, where strong amnesty laws mainly just continued to block any effort at prosecutions for past human rights violations to this day. And then we have these super interesting cases like Colombia, that is a modern leader in human rights, transitional justice in the world today, that very recently have had, as you know, extremely innovative Truth Commission, extensive reparations policies, again, the most extensive reparation policies in the world, encompassing the widest range of types of harms. The Colombian policy has been very attentive to gender issues, for example, something that did not happen initially in either Argentina or Chile. Finally, if I can say, there's countries like Guatemala that have been kind of on a whole zigzag trajectory. Guatemala, there were many demands for justice. There were excellent truth commissions. And there was the beginning of these prosecutions, including prosecutions of very high-level people like former President Rios Montt, right, who presided over the period of the genocide in Guatemala. I should clarify, the only case in Latin America where I use the term genocide is Guatemala, though a case can also be made for Peru. But then Guatemala has gone through these democratic swings that we've seen. And when more authoritarian leaders come into power, they shut down these prosecutions. And then when we have, as we've had recently in Guatemala, a democratic reopening, the prosecutions reopen again. So it really shows this link that I talked about between democracy and accountability, especially criminal accountability in courts.
Could we go back to Argentina for a minute? Argentina right now has a president who doesn't believe in the past. Is this reflected in your database yet? What do you see the situation as being in terms of transitional justice going forward?
So first, we have actually gathered data. It's one of the few cases where we've gathered data directly from the Ministry of Justice. So the data we have in the database is material we got from the Ministry of Justice. The prosecutions are still moving ahead in Argentina. The Ministry of Justice has some autonomy. The prosecutor's office that is prosecuting these crimes has some autonomy. They're moving ahead. These prosecutions were stopped during the time that the amnesty laws were in effect. They were reopened when the Congress nullified the amnesty laws and when the Supreme Court also decided that they were unconstitutional. So all branches of government were involved in this decision of reopening the trials. And for the time being, those trials continue to move forward. Now, it's a very complicated story because every single prosecution in Argentina to be finalized has to go to the Supreme Court. In this particular case, we've been able to track them, and there are many, many trials still in process, and many of the perpetrators are dying. So the main way that trials are ending in Argentina so far is not because the Milei government is shutting them down, but because the accused are dying. And of course, you can no longer continue a criminal trial if the perpetrator dies, if the accused dies. So that's what's happening right now in Argentina. At any moment, of course, I think things could happen that would shut down the existing trials. But for the time being, that has not happened yet.
That's good news.
Mhm.
You mentioned in the case of Colombia that the government mechanisms were paying attention to the issue of gender. Could you explain that both in terms of Colombia and then get into the whole issue of feminism and gender rights?
So just as I said, demand from justice often came from victims. Demand for gender justice also came from victims. It originally came from women. The original campaigns that really started in the 1980s were campaigns for attention to violence against women. And the first ever convention on violence against women was the Latin American Convention, the Inter-American Convention on Violence Against Women, or Belén de Pará, it's called, where it was signed. So Latin America, again, was a leader here in starting to prosecute people for gender crimes. And that included crimes like situations of illegal detention where women were raped in detention. But it also, over time, took on a broader interpretation of gender to include not just women, but gender minorities and also men and boys who sometimes can suffer from gender crimes as well. So one of the trials I always remember was, I believe in Ecuador, a trial where a police officer is convicted for dereliction of duty because he fails to intervene in a crowd that's beating up a trans individual. Now that qualifies in our database as a gender trial, even though the gender doesn't appear in the charge, it's dereliction of duty. Okay.
Mhm.
So then Colombia comes at the end of this. So this new attention to gender, the widening of gender concerns beyond violence against women to include a broader group of people are all now present in historical time at the time that the Colombian Reparations Policy and Truth Commission start to operate. So the reparations policy includes as one of its types of harm, includes gender harm as one of the types of harm for which you can be receive reparations. And in particular, the Truth Commission, which came the latest in all of this, consulted with women's groups, LGBTQ groups, as it was working, took testimony, and has a whole chapter on gender issues and transitional justice, and a series of recommendations around gender. So that sort of shows how far a country can go at this moment in time in a way that didn't feel possible 2 decades ago.
How does abortion figure into this, if it does?
In transitional justice, that is justice that involves transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, or from conflict to peace, or sometimes both of those at the same time. Sometimes, as we know, you have countries that are both making a transition to democracy and to peace. In those kinds of mechanisms, we haven't seen abortion appear. Now, our database, even though we call it's a transitional justice database, in fact, is a database of accountability in the whole world. And so when you go to the website and you look at a mechanism, you can filter for transitional, for conflict related, or for non-transitional. So you can look at what's happening in what might be called more ordinary justice questions in countries that have not passed through a transition. And so we have coded for gender in all of our mechanisms, and I have not found abortion appearing here.
When you talk about gender violence, is that only gender violence which is politically related, or would it also be talking about domestic violence?
Just in order to keep things manageable, and this goes to the heart of a human rights violation, right? Is that generally we are only coding crimes committed by state officials. Unless it's a civil war case, in which case we look at crimes committed by state officials and by armed groups. So the FARC, for example, in Colombia. Why do you do that? Because otherwise you have a database of all prosecutions of all countries, and it's completely unmanageable.
Mhm.
But more deeply, the notion is government is supposed to protect you. And when the government goes over to be the main threat to your safety and well-being, that's what we consider a human rights violation. Either that, or whether a government is so complicit in a situation that even though they themselves haven't committed the crime, that they have sometimes facilitated the crime.
You mentioned in the case of Argentina that you were getting data from the Ministry of Justice. In most Latin American cases, where does your data come from?
In the Chilean case, for example, we have it from something called the Observatorio. It's an NGO, kind of an academic / NGO that has been gathering data. They've been gathering data from the Ministry of Justice, but they've published it and shared it with us, and we get it from there. Otherwise, we're using mainly news sources, and mainly news sources in English, though we also have recorded news sources in Spanish. We've had Spanish coders that make the data available. So because of that, we also have used academic sources as well. So we have some people, a colleague who works on Portugal, for example, has helped us with the Portuguese data. I want to use this as an opportunity to say that we see this website as a work in progress. And the website has places where when people read it and they feel like we're missing something, they literally can go to a place where you can submit a comment and make suggestions for changes. So the website is imperfect still. When I read it, I still discover problems with it that I'm noting down and trying to figure out how we're going to fix. Anyone who listens to this, I want to say, go to transitionaljusticedata.org, see our website, go to those country pages where you have expertise, and give us some feedback if you think we're missing things.
Great. Have you gotten comments so far?
We have gotten comments already. In fact, on the Portuguese case, when the colleague who works in Portugal gave us really useful feedback, Felipe Raimundo, who's a Portuguese scholar.
That's great. But why on earth did you decide to do a database?
I decided to do a database when I first started working on this issue. I was following the trials in Argentina. I'd lived in Argentina in 1985 doing my dissertation research on an entirely different topic. But I was there during the trials of the juntas. The whole year as the trials of the juntas were going on, I was in Buenos Aires. The public could attend the trials. A couple of times I sat in the audience. There was something called the Diario del Juicio. It was a weekly newspaper that was published every week, giving all the details of the trials. I made a full collection of those that I brought home with me and I still have in my personal library. So I started talking about this issue of transitional justice and that I saw it kind of increasing in the world. And then, of course, we had the Pinochet trial in London and everyone started paying attention. Then we had the creation of the new International Criminal Court back in 1998. And so I said, something's happening here. And people initially said to me, in Argentina, maybe it's happening, but no place else. And so I originally started collecting data, very rough data with the help of some research assistants, just to kind of make a little diagram to show people that I wasn't making this up. And it wasn't just Argentina, that it was a trend in the world and we should be paying attention to it. Then I had very brilliant graduate students who started working with me and they realized we can use this data to answer some questions. People say that transitional justice makes things worse. There was a lot of discussion early on, you may remember, including from serious Latin American scholars like Guillermo O'Donnell and others who feared that this accountability would undermine democracy. There were big disagreements within the human rights community themselves. There's a famous debate between two of the most important early human rights activists in Argentina and Chile, between Pepe Salaquet, who worked for the Vicaría de Solidaridad, and Juan Méndez, who worked on Argentina. And Juan Méndez was sort of really saying these trials can make things better. And Pepe Salaquet was very worried that it would lead to undermining the more recent transition to democracy in Chile. And so we realized we could use our data, not just to say, see, it's really happening, but to say, what impact can we see that trials have on democracy? And we started to do that. I'm not the methods whiz, but was working with fabulous graduate students and I learned a thing or two. And I found we could begin to say with confidence that the human rights prosecutions were not associated in general with coups, and that they were associated with improvements in human rights.
That's an amazing finding. Do you
Yes.
have anything else to add about the database or about your investigations in general?
Well, and the other thing I actually like about having a database and quantitative data is that when something happens that surprises you, like this decline in trials, you're confronted with that as well. I then come forward and instead of to insist that the justice cascade is going on, with no change, I have to grapple with the really difficult issue of what's going on. Why are trials declining? And that's a healthy thing for an academic. For activists as well, it's healthy to know that some of the things we've claimed were true up to a certain point, but may no longer be true.
Can you end on an optimistic note?
The most important finding we have is that transitional justice is a pretty new innovation. I mean, when I started working on Argentina back in the 70s, no one talked about the possibility of accountability. No one believed it was even possible to hold leaders accountable for crimes. Nowadays, everyone talks about it and takes it almost for granted. So we hear things that are now happening in the International Criminal Court, arrest warrants out for Putin, arrest warrants out for Netanyahu, and they just assume, well, of course, that's the thing that should be done. We should get arrest warrants. They may say, oh, it'll never work. We'll never get those people in the dock, which is also probably true. So we've come a really, in a relatively short time, historical time, that we've come a long way in terms of going from thinking accountability was impossible to seeing it present in almost all of our debates. I take that to mean that change is possible in the world and that the kind of pressures that human rights activists and victims brought in Latin America first, to demand accountability has led to a transformation of our world as we know it. Those demands for accountability will often be frustrated. That's part of it, but sometimes they will succeed. It takes a long time. No one should hold their breath and wait. And yet things happened so that people like Rios Montt, leaders like Rios Montt of Guatemala, or Bordaberry of Uruguay, or Videla, or Pinochet, were either prosecuted and convicted before they died, or in Pinochet's case, died knowing he was facing prosecution at home for human rights violations and for corruption.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Kathryn Sikkink. She's the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Jen, for inviting me.